Canada was directly involved in bioweapons research with the Chinese Communist Party's Wuhan Institute of Virology, research that likely led to the COVID-19 pandemic, resulting in millions of lives lost, the erosion of civil liberties worldwide, and the collapse of the global economy. This week, our own government admitted that our top security laboratories were sending deadly viruses to China's military. This should have been an international scandal, yet shockingly, it's barely caused a ripple. But before we dive into the specifics, let's just take a moment to understand how serious it is for Canada's top security biolaboratories to collaborate with a totalitarian regime on bioweapons research. Imagine if during World War II, Canada was collaborating with the Soviet Union on nuclear energy research. Now, imagine the Canadian government discovering that the Soviets were stealing this research to develop nuclear bombs. Then, they made a deliberate decision to do nothing and allow their deadly research to continue being stolen by a hostile regime. Picture one of those bombs being dropped, whether intentional or not, resulting in mass destruction and chaos. Now imagine Canada's response to this catastrophe was locking its citizens in their homes for years, coercing them into taking ineffective experimental pharmaceuticals to deal with the nuclear fallout, and silencing those who dared to ask questions by suing and censoring them. As absurd as it sounds, this is the parallel we are facing today. Canada was working on research that caused a global catastrophe, and rather than owning its responsibility, the government chose deception, suppression, and control. Admittedly, these are extraordinary claims, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So, give me just a few moments of your precious time, and I will present the irrefutable case that Trudeau's administration bears immense responsibility for the COVID crisis. First, we must not underestimate the Chinese Communist Party's proficiency in exploiting the weaknesses of democratic nations. They manipulated the Canadian government with laughable ease. The CCP paints a picture of international cooperation for the betterment of humanity through shared scientific research, and naive Western politicians, too busy basking in their own virtue, become enamored with the idea of being written into the history books as global saviors. They conveniently ignore the reality that they are dealing with a totalitarian communist regime that has openly stated its ambitions to become the dominant world power by 2050, a feat only ever achieved through force. Through this so-called global cooperation, a hostile foreign military ended up stealing bioweapons-grade materials, and our so-called leaders handed them over without hesitation. One of the key tools used by the CCP is the 1,000 Talents program. As a parliamentary report put it, this initiative, quote, uses incentives such as salaries, research funding, and laboratory space to encourage Chinese researchers abroad to transmit knowledge to the People's Republic of China. CSIS director David Vigneault didn't mince words when he said, the PRC is by far the greatest perpetrator of these activities. Canada's National Microbiology Laboratory, or NML, in Winnipeg became the epicenter of this exploitation from 2013 to 2019. Scientists like Dr. Chu fell right into the trap, working directly with the Wuhan Institute of Virology and transferring deadly pathogens to a regime with a well-documented history of weaponizing biological research. Trudeau's government, either oblivious or indifferent to the dangers, allowed Dr. Chu to maintain secretive connections with Chinese military research institutions. She, quote, used Canada's Level 4 biosecurity laboratory as a base to assist China, collaborating with Major General Chen Wei, China's leading expert on bioweapons and bioterrorism. CSIS labeled Dr. Chu as a credible threat to Canada's national security, and yet the Trudeau administration did nothing. Even after receiving these warnings, the Canadian government approved the shipment of Ebola and Nipah viruses to Wuhan and refused multiple orders from Parliament to reveal how they made such an egregious decision. China sold us the comforting lie of collaboration for resilience, but their real objective was clear: to gain access to bioweapons-grade pathogens. A Cornell University study from 2021 revealed something deeply alarming. In raw sequencing reads from samples of 5 COVID-19 patients in Wuhan, traces of the Nipah virus, a CDC-designated bioterrorism agent, were detected. This virus wasn't just casually present, it was found in an infectious clone format, which means Wuhan scientists were working with an assembled version of this highly lethal virus. This discovery wasn't just about contamination or coincidence, it was evidence of direct lab manipulation of a biosafety level 4 pathogen. In other words, viruses with a high risk of mortality spread through aerosols for which no treatment is available. The Nipah virus is so dangerous that it should only ever be handled in the most secure BSL-4 laboratories. But China's only BSL-4 lab didn't even exist until 2018. Yet experiments involving these highly dangerous pathogens were carried out, involving both Wuhan and Canada. In 2016, Dr. Chu conducted Ebola experiments in collaboration with the Chinese Academy of Sciences. These tests were performed on macaques in China, at facilities not accredited to handle such a lethal pathogen, and on mice at Canada's National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg. And that's where the real issue lies. Canada was not only working on Ebola and Nipah research with a foreign totalitarian power, but we're also collaborating with a lab that wasn't even certified to handle these pathogens. This partnership led to what we're seeing now. Nipah sequences were embedded in synthetic lab constructs within COVID-19 patient samples from Wuhan. This means that Wuhan researchers were manipulating multiple deadly viruses, leaving behind genetic markers that ended up in COVID-19 samples. And where did they get the Nipah virus to experiment with? From Canada. This wasn't just foolishness. This reckless collaboration may have helped unleash a global pandemic. It wasn't until July 2019 that the RCMP finally intervened, escorting Dr. Chu and Chang out of the National Microbiology Laboratory. This came almost a full year after CSIS had flagged them as a serious threat to Canadian national security back in August 2018. Why did the government take so long to act on such an obvious risk? For nearly a year, they stood by and did nothing. Even after the scientists were removed, Trudeau's government continued to drag its feet, delaying their official termination until January 2021. Because of these delays, the scientists were able to return to China unquestioned, and they didn't simply fade away, they re-emerged under new identities, working in prestigious Chinese institutions directly tied to the People's Liberation Army. Instead of facing accountability, they are now conducting research under the protection of the Chinese government, advancing the very work that sparked this crisis in the first place. The incompetence and corruption within Trudeau's administration seems boundless. What unfolded next was arguably the largest cover-up in Canadian history. When Parliament demanded unredacted documents, Trudeau's government refused, not once, but 4 times. They even went so far as to sue the Speaker of the House to prevent the release of these documents. Ironically, this was the same Speaker, Anthony Rota, who Trudeau would later throw under the bus, falsely blaming him for the House of Commons scandal involving applause for a Nazi veteran, an incident that ultimately led to Rota's resignation. Although 2 years passed between Rota's questioning of the government and his unethical forced resignation, it raises the question of whether this was political payback for pressuring Trudeau on the Winnipeg lab scandal. But one thing is abundantly clear. Trudeau's government was determined to keep Canadians, and the rest of the world for that matter, in the dark about their catastrophic failures. Why is the Trudeau administration so hostile to the truth? Because the truth reveals criminal negligence and deep-rooted corruption. It shows that they allowed scientists with military ties to access Canada's most secure laboratory and share sensitive, potentially deadly research with Beijing. This is far beyond incompetence, though. It's a deliberate cover-up aimed at protecting Trudeau's image, even at the cost of global security. It's almost unbelievable, but the story gets even crazier. While Canadians were still being subjected to ruthless COVID-19 measures, the Trudeau government decided to call a snap election in September 2021. Nobody was asking for an election. The country was still in turmoil, healthcare systems were overwhelmed, businesses were shutting down, and the world had become so chaotic that no one even knew which direction was forward. Yet Trudeau called an election during this crisis and immediately went into campaign mode.
You deserve better. You deserve a government that's going to continue to say, get vaccinated. And you know what? If you don't want to get vaccinated, that's your choice. But don't think you can get on a plane or a train besides vaccinated people and put them at risk.
So what was the political utility of calling an election? It served as a convenient distraction from the questions piling up about Canada's involvement in the pandemic and froze investigations into the matter. Even worse, a public inquiry into foreign interference has since revealed that the Chinese government actively meddled in our elections, manipulating certain ridings to favor the Liberals. The timing couldn't have been more suspect. Trudeau's snap election delayed investigations, have seemingly erased accountability, and allowed for foreign influence to further undermine the democratic process. We must remember the direct impact this scandal had on all of our lives. The consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic were catastrophic, and we lived through them. Millions lost their lives, healthcare systems collapsed, and economies were decimated. While incompetence is a major theme of the pandemic, all of this points to something far worse. They imposed tyranny, shattered lives, destroyed businesses, and mandated unproven interventions, all while dodging the blame for the nightmare they helped create. Our politicians love to say we need to learn the lessons from COVID-19. So, what have we learned? We learned that our government willingly handed over some of the deadliest viruses to a lab tied to a hostile regime. We learned that our leaders will prioritize their own political optics over public safety, and they'll lie, hide documents, and even use legal action to cover up their failures. So the question now is, where's the accountability? Those who bear responsibility are still in power. Canadian politicians shouldn't have to be apologizing for suggesting Nuremberg-style trials. If anything, we should be demanding them. The truth is, unless we demand accountability and change, we risk repeating the same disastrous mistake of trusting the government in the future. And the world simply can't afford that.